Hi everyone, welcome to this video tutorial on how to use the GETPIVOTDATA function in Microsoft Excel. Now, GETPIVOTDATA is always something that I as a trainer get lots of questions about. I think people aren't really sure what it is or how to utilize it, and then when they do, they come across a few little issues. So really what I want to do in this video is just run through GETPIVOTDATA, how it works, how you can toggle it off and on, and how you can get around some of those little issues that you may come across when using it. So on the screen here I have a pivot table that I've already created, and this pivot table currently is showing the sum of profit across numerous different products for the months of the year. And what I also have next to this pivot table is another smaller table. Now this one isn't a pivot table. You can see when I click in it, I don't get any of my pivot table utilities. But what I essentially want to do here is I want to populate both columns of this table using the pivot table data. And this is pretty much what the GETPIVOTDATA function does for you. Now, just for a bit of background reference, the GETPIVOTDATA function is part of the lookup and reference formulas category. And there you go, you can see it sitting in there. And it's also a function that automatically gets invoked when you try to reference data that's contained within a pivot table. So let me just start out by very quickly showing you what I mean. If I click in cell K4 and type in equals, what I want to appear in here is the sum of profit for Burlington in January. So I'm going to go across to my pivot table, I'm going to find my Burlington column and January, and if I click on this cell, you can see what I get is an extremely long GETPIVOTDATA formula. So as you can see there, GETPIVOTDATA is automatically invoked when Excel recognizes that you're trying to reference data in cells contained within a pivot table. So if we just read across so we understand what this formula is doing, we can see here it says profit and then it says A3. And you'll always find this in the GETPIVOTDATA formula. It's going to give you first the upper leftmost cell. It's kind of like a table reference point in a way. It then goes through and looks for the product and it's pulling back Burlington and then the month name of January. And if I hit enter here, I can see, if I just do a quick visual check, that that number is in fact correct. So far, so good. Now what I essentially want to do is complete the rest of these blank cells. So ordinarily, what I would normally do would be to grab my little autofill handle and drag all the way down. But look what happens when I do that. I get the same figure for each of the months, which obviously isn't correct. Now if I dive into one of these other months, so let's double click on July and take a look at what the formula is doing, you can see it's basically exactly the same formula. It's looking for Burlington and it's also looking for January as opposed to July, which is what should be in this cell. So when I'm copying that formula down, it's not modifying anything in the formula. And this is where people start to come a cropper when using GETPIVOTDATA. They're not really sure why that's happening or how you can modify that. It's actually a pretty simple problem to correct. So let's go in to our January formula again. All you need to do is replace these field names with cell references. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to change where it says product Burlington. I'm going to double click on Burlington and I'm going to replace the word with a cell reference. And I'm going to utilize the table that I'm currently working in. So I'm going to click on cell K3 because that contains the word Burlington. Now in a moment I want to copy this down and across. So I'm going to need to do some absolute referencing here in order for that to work. So if I'm copying it across, I definitely don't want to lock the column, but I do want to lock the row. So I'm going to put my dollar symbol in front of the row only. I'm then going to do exactly the same for the month. So where we have January, I'm going to double click and I'm going to replace that with a cell reference, which in this case is J4. And for this one, I'm going to copy this down. So I don't want to lock the row, but I do want to lock the column. So a dollar symbol in there and hit enter. And now if I autofill down, you can see that that's working, and if I autofill across as well, everything here is working very nicely. So that's really all you have to do, just replace those cell references to get everything to work. Now you might be wondering, why on earth do I need to use the GETPIVOTDATA function when constructing my formulas? Can't I just type in equals and then the cell reference from the pivot table and do it that way? Well, yes, you could do that and it would work. But what you'll find is that if you change the layout of your pivot table, then you're going to start to have problems. So at the moment, because I'm utilizing GETPIVOTDATA, if I was to move some of these fields around in my pivot table, so let's drag product down into rows to get that layout to display differently, my figures are still working correctly. I've got all my figures in here, even though the values have changed location. Now I'm going to quickly undo out of there, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn off that GETPIVOTDATA toggle and then show you what happens if you use cell references. So I'm going to delete everything out of here. Now, if you do want to turn off GETPIVOTDATA, and what I mean by that is when you type equals and then reference a cell in a pivot table, you don't get that long GETPIVOTDATA formula. If you want to turn that off, click in your pivot table, go up to Pivot Table Analyze, and in the first group here, click the Options drop down, and you'll see here I've got a tick next to Generate GETPIVOTDATA. But what I could do is untick that, and I can now utilize cell references instead. So if we go back to our table, if I type in equals, I'm looking for Burlington January, I'm going to click the cell, and now I get the cell reference as opposed to the GETPIVOTDATA formula. Hit enter. I can double click to autofill this down, and as I mentioned, it does actually work. And I could do the same for Vermont, so equals, and we're going over here this time, G5, and I could then copy that down and I have my totals. So far so good. The problems start to occur with this method when you start to change the layout of your pivot table. So if I go up to Pivot Table Analyze, let's bring up our field list, and again I'm going to do the same thing, drag product underneath month name, and you'll see what happens. I'm missing some figures for Burlington and I'm missing all of my figures for Vermont, and that's because the location of these values has changed. So that is the big difference between using cell references as opposed to GETPIVOTDATA. I'm sure you can see GETPIVOTDATA in the long run is a lot more beneficial, as you can change the layout and the figures will still be correct. Now I've just turned GETPIVOTDATA back on and I've completed my table using the GETPIVOTDATA formula. Now one thing you need to watch out for here is that this GETPIVOTDATA formula will continue to work as long as you don't remove the fields from the pivot table that the formula is referring to. So my formula is referring to the product and the month name. Now, if in my pivot table I decide to get rid of product from columns by just removing it, I'm going to get errors throughout because the field it's referring to is no longer there. So just bear that in mind, that whilst you are free to move your field names around and this will still work, if you actually get rid of one of them, then that formula is going to break and you'll need to redo it again. But hopefully that explains exactly what GETPIVOTDATA is, how you can use it, some of the pitfalls you might come across, and also how you can turn it off and work with cell references instead.